Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to our webinar presentation on the importance of being professionally and personally. If this is your first webinar, welcome, and I would like to quickly just introduce myself. My name is Amanda Henty, and I'm the Alumni Professional Development Coordinator here at St. Louis University. I started my role in July of 2015, and since then I have been working on establishing and strengthening different alumni professional development programming, and this webinar series is a part of that initiative. I will mention that I have a cold, so I apologize if my voice is a little bit off. Hopefully it'll be clear and hold up throughout the presentation. Our presentation today will be recorded and available for viewing early next week on our main SLU YouTube page. And I will send out an email to you all again early next week that has the link to that as well as slides from today's presentation. The chat feature will be available for you to send questions. We will have a designated period of time at the end of today's presentation for questions, but feel free to send them throughout the presentation, and we'll just answer them at the end. If at any point during the presentation you experience technical issues, I ask that you contact GoToWebinar directly, and I will put their phone number in the chat section so that you have that. Again, I'd like to mention that this presentation is a bit more interactive, so there will be different questions asked of you, so feel free to just chat them in so that we can get the most out of that. So now I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lubna Somjee. Dr. Somjee is a 1993 Arts and Science alum and a licensed psychologist and executive coach. Welcome, Dr. Somjee.
Thank you, Amanda. And I have to also preface this by saying I have a little bit of a cough, so both you and I are going to be struggling a little bit today, but hopefully it'll be okay. So let's get started. So I'm really excited to be here and do something for my fellow SLU alum. I was, as Amanda mentioned, I was here from '89 to '93, psychology undergraduate, headed for pre-law, but my career took a bit of a turn, so I'm here today. And I actually own my own business. I provide two very separate lines of service. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I work with individuals and couples and have a subspecialty in medical psychology. But I'm also an executive coach, which is a bit of a misnomer, as executive coaches now work with people at all stages of their career and places in their careers. And I work with people to help them with professional issues, such as skill building around certain things, leadership, moving up the career ladder, or pivoting to different careers, and also do consulting for organizations. And today, I'm going to talk about the importance of being and what all that means and how we can do that for ourselves. So, as I walk around my daily life, much like yourself, I run into a lot of different people at work, volunteer organizations, and social events, and my kids' school. And of course, as we know, as people run into each other in these different venues, we often ask how all of us are doing. And 90% of the time, most people I've observed anyways will respond by saying, "I'm good, I'm busy." And then they sort of launch into all the ways in which they're busy at work, at home, how far out they may be booked socially and professionally, how busy their kids are, and how there's really no time to breathe. I see this everywhere. I'm sure you see this too. And what's interesting is a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people who walk around talking about how busy they are, they sometimes wear it like a badge of honor, as if it's a sign of how important they are or their work is. And I get it. Everyone is busy. And I think this, this next picture sort of sums up how many of us might be feeling on any given day because of all our demands. I mean, think about it. How many of you feel sped up? What is it that's contributing to that? How does it impact you? We are sped up a lot. I mean, we're speeding all the time. How many of us really drive 30 miles an hour down a road? We run around trying to multitask. Our brains can't really do that, but we try anyway. We get upset when the internet slows down. We try to eat food quickly and move on. One of my friends told me the other day that she took a speed yoga class, which just seems so counterintuitive, but that's how we are as a society right now. And I used to be like those people who say they're busy all the time. And I'm not proud of this, but I wore it as if it were a badge of honor, as if somehow it made me important or the work that I was doing important in terms of contributing to the world in some way. And one day it sort of changed for me. One day I was just looking in the mirror and kind of noticed something and leaned in, and all of a sudden realized I had all this gray hair that had not been there the day before. And I was sort of shocked and thinking to myself, why was this not there yesterday? And in the seconds following that, I realized, well, obviously, this was a slow, gradual situation. The gray hair had indeed been there yesterday. The issue was that I had not been present. I had not been present for about 9, 10 months of my life previous to that. And I was racing around because I had taken on a project. An organization had contacted me to help them with a long-term strategic plan that they were implementing. It was about a 9 or 10 month project, and I was devoting anywhere between 5 to 20 hours a week to this particular project for about 9 or 10 months, like I said. This was on top of my full-time business. This was on top of my family obligations and volunteer obligations. And I was racing around, and life was not rich. And I was just not connected. I was doing what I needed to do, but I wasn't present. And I was just flying from one thing to the other. And in that moment in front of the mirror, it was sort of a wake-up call for me. And it made me realize, life is way too short for me to be quite this busy and this disconnected. So it was in that moment that I decided to shift gears and live my life a little bit more intentionally. So obviously I still have numerous demands, as do all of you, but the way I approach them is different, and it has made the difference for me, and it has also made the difference for those clients and patients whom I talk with this about. So what are some of the side effects on living on fast forward? What are some of the signs that, we're doing too much? While this list that you're seeing on the screen is certainly not an exhaustive list, it kind of illustrates some of the things that can happen to us when we're on fast forward. Amanda, I don't know about for you or even the rest of the audience, but for me, some of the early red flags that I'm on fast forward and I'm doing too much are things like muscle tension, irritability, and I just get sort of cognitively fatigued, get overwhelmed with all the mental stuff that I'm having to process during the course of a normal day. And for me, those are some of the early signs that, perhaps I'm doing too much too quickly. How about you, Amanda? Are there any particular signs that you notice within yourself or our audience?
I'm looking at the list, and I have a lot of these.
Yeah.
I would say the ones I notice quickly are definitely fatigue, decreased focus. It usually takes me
Mm-hmm.
like twice as long to do something. And I do have difficulty sleeping as well.
Mm-hmm. Those are
And
pretty common.
again, throughout the presentation, if anybody wants to just chat in some answers, I'd be happy to read off some examples as well. So feel free to just participate as much or as little as you'd like.
Yeah, the audience, you may find that some of these resonate for you, or perhaps you have a different set of sort of quote unquote side effects that you notice first, and it'd be great for you to write in about them. I want to give you an example about living on fast forward. I'm going to be actually talking about several case studies throughout the presentation. And while these are executive coaching clients from all over the country, I do mask or tweak a lot of the information so that they wouldn't be identified, because you never know, it's a small world. So a while back, I was working with a woman who was transitioning sort of from early career to mid-career. She worked in a small marketing firm of about 20 people. They catered to particular niche industries. This was a marketing firm that was actually expanding quite rapidly. They were very fast-paced at the firm. They did marketing, but they also put out media fires when needed. And she was often the face of the company in putting out some of these media fires. She initially came in for coaching for a couple of different reasons. One, she had been given a team to lead and was relatively new at leading that team and wanted to have some better leadership skills. She also came in because management had asked her to comment on a small part of the strategic plan, and she wanted to think that through. And she was also trying to see if she was a good fit for this industry or if she needed to switch gears and find a different career path. In addition to all of this stuff going on at work, she also had a partner and children. And at one point, really early on in our work, she was describing how overwhelmed she felt. She was having more difficulty keeping track of things as a result. She was less communicative with her team. She was tired, she was anxious, and this woman had an autoimmune disorder that actually had been pretty manageable, but because of the stress had been flaring up pretty significantly. And it left her sort of depleted and less productive. And she asked me, and she kept asking me, like, what should I do? What do I need to do? Do I delegate? Do I work longer hours to keep up? Should I be coming in on the weekends to work? What do I do? Tell me what to do and I'll do it. The thing is, that's a valid question, right? Because what can we realistically do? Most of us have incredible demands and responsibilities. Oftentimes, when we're faced with this, our impulse is to speed up and do more. And frankly, sometimes that's necessary, right? We can't be naive in the world we live in. But that's not always going to be a useful default. Because a lot of times what we may need to be doing is to simply be. And by that I mean do the internal work that's required to kind of guide and frame our external work, understanding ourselves and our context before we step forward to do. And in this case, I'm using the term be in a very specific way and based on very specific steps. In terms of being, what I mean is one, really pausing for a moment and really stepping out of the fray or stepping back for a moment. By being, I mean sifting through our experiences, really, looking up and around and seeing what's happening to us in different areas of our lives, what the demands really are, how we are meeting those demands. Are we being responsive or reactive? And the third step in B is really analyzing. Why are we doing all that we're doing? Why are we feeling the way that we are? What could be happening instead? What are our options? And the last step of being is sort of refining what we need or want to be doing before we actually move forward and jump in. Being is about intentionality as opposed to being sort of a leaf in the wind, sort of being pushed and pulled by different demands. And one of the reasons it's really important to be is, and this is just one reason, is there was a study that came out, a Harvard study, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And this study showed that almost 47% of the time, so almost half the time that we're awake, we are completely lost in thought. And so the combination of being on fast forward and doing and doing and doing and being lost in thought is not useful, as one would imagine. And so one of the things that being does is it helps you to step back and sort of consolidate and really take a close look at what's going on. So obviously okay to do, but sometimes you need to be. And I want to give you a quick example that sort of illustrates the importance of being in a really obvious way, and then we're going to jump into ways in terms of how to be. So, for example, a couple of years ago, a VP of a company had contacted me. This is someone I knew already, and she had been noticing with some of the other higher-ups that a particular department in the company was showing less and less productivity over the past few months. There's less productivity coming out of the department to the point that more recently it was starting to then result in increased turnover, which is obviously not good. And she was a bit panicked and she was asking me, what should I do? What do we do to fix this? Because I think the issue is morale. I'm not sure. And so should we institute a casual Friday? Should we take the team out to lunch? You know, do we give them more money? Like, what do we do? What do you think we need to do? And so after talking with her and kind of assessing some of the other things they had done up until this phone call, the primary thing I said to her was, well, it might be useful to just step back first. Instead of doing and throwing a bunch of things against a wall and seeing what might stick, why don't you just step back first and really assess the landscape, what's going on? Because the reality is you can't do anything until you know what's causing this, right? So perhaps the issue is that they're hiring really good talent, but perhaps the talent is not matched well to this particular department. Or perhaps the employees in the department are not getting enough direction. Perhaps there's a toxic manager or lack of trust in the team, or maybe it's as simple as they don't have enough resources to do their job. But the important thing is to step back, because stepping back provides the benefit of having a bigger picture. That bigger picture allows for awareness with yourself, what's happening to you, awareness about the problem or what the issues are you're dealing with and how to address them. And essentially, it allows for clarity. It gives us room to think and really think and be responsive as opposed to reactive to all the demands in our lives. And that VP ended up doing that. She took a step back, and instead of focusing on solutions, she just tried to get a sense of the landscape, and they were very easily able to pinpoint what the cause was and address it appropriately, right? So just as stepping back on an organizational level is important and obvious, stepping back at an individual level can be just as important and helpful as well. So how do we do that? So the woman that I talked about before in the marketing firm, she stepped back. She found it incredibly awkward. She was very type A, go, go, go. So for her to take a step back and survey the landscape made intellectual sense, but it was really awkward for her. And when she did that and when she started doing some things, she realized that stepping back allowed her to think more clearly and to do things in a purposeful way as opposed to just doing them. She got a much better sense of what was fueling her to do too much. Some of it were obviously the demands in her life, professional and personal, but she also realized that at work, one of the things that was really driving her to do too much was her people-pleasing and her imposter syndrome, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. With the clarity, she realized how she wanted to engage in her work differently and her team differently and home differently. And over a period of a couple of months, this translated to her leading a team that was much more cohesive. She was able to lay out a much more thoughtful piece of the strategic plan that was different than the one she initially came up with when she was going. She felt more relaxed. Her autoimmune issues were calming down. And she realized that, and this is most important, she realized that she really liked her job in this career path and that she wanted to stay. So today we're going to be talking about how to be. The reality is that there's many approaches, excuse me, and to be honest, many of the best approaches are individualized because not one way or approach fits everybody. But we're going to be focusing on some basic approaches today that hopefully will be a useful, at least starting off point. We're going to be talking about approaches like self-assessment, clarifying your drives, assessing your values, developing a blueprint, as well as engaging in check-ins. Excuse me. So the first thing is, if you're feeling busy and overwhelmed, how can you course correct? The first step is really assessing where you are, because most people, not everyone, but most people, when they're on fast forward and they're doing a lot, they don't necessarily realize it until they hit a wall. And trying to course correct when you hit a wall is possible, but it's a little bit like throwing a pebble at a charging bear. I've never tried it, but one would imagine it would not be the most effective thing. So the first thing is to really assess where you're at. So another case study to sort of clarify that. I worked with someone in the legal field a few years ago. He really enjoyed his work. He really enjoyed connecting with his clients. But mounting rules and regulations were really forcing him to work longer and on more paperwork, and less time was being spent with his clients. This was a guy who was incredibly conscientious. He cared about his work, but really because of the load felt really overwhelmed. He had originally come in for executive coaching because his goal was to move up the ladder in his career, and now he wasn't sure he wanted to do that because he was so overwhelmed. He talked about being tired, his morale was clearly low, and he was starting to resent his clients and coworkers, which was not the norm at all for this man, and clearly was starting to burn out. It wasn't until I sort of pointed all this out to him that he even noticed how profoundly his work was impacting him at work and at home and his health, and decided he really needed to feel better about his work and be productive. So my point being is you don't want to let being on fast forward creep up on you. And so as you look at this slide, I'm curious if the audience can relate to any of these things as they're going through this assessment. These are just basic questions. They're certainly not an exhaustive list of questions. But these constructs really go a long way towards sort of what I consider professional and personal fortitude. The difference between being an okay professional to a really amazing professional, right? For example. So starting with physical well-being, like, how healthy do you feel overall? How does your body feel at the beginning and the end of the day? How's your sleep? Do you allot time for exercise? Do you go for regular checkups? Do you know your medical numbers? Do you feel like you're resting enough or working too much? Emotionally, where are you? Do you feel more irritable or anxious or tense? Are you expressing care or appreciation for important people in your life? What's your story when you're in conflict? Meaning when there's conflict or stress, do you tend to play the victim? Do you personalize and assume that everything's your fault? Or do you just kind of keep your head down and move forward and avoid things, right? Do you have a long-term view or a wide lens? Meaning, are you able to keep things in perspective when things come at you, personally or professionally? Mentally, take note of, how you're doing mentally. Are you easily distracted? Do you get distracted by technology easily? I would say that's an issue that I never talked about 10 years ago, and it's something I talk about a lot now. We're constantly bombarded with stimuli from technology that also sort of wears us down. How much time do you spend day to day doing things you like or with long-term value? Or do you feel clear-headed? How much are you working in the evenings and the weekends? And then the spiritual piece, why do you do what you do? What do you feel is your purpose, either at work or at home? Are you, in general, spending your life the way that you would like, week to week, month to month? Of course, knowing that many of us have to work. Are you allocating time for things important to you? Things like that. So again, just a very basic self-assessment to see how you're doing. I don't know about you, Amanda, but for me, and I'd be curious to hear from the audience as well, for me, one of the things that I tend to bump up against that, again, lets me know I'm on fast forward is I tend not to allocate time to things that are important to me to kind of replenish myself. And the other sign, which I alluded to earlier, was that when I'm on fast forward and I'm trying to find a way to see if I am on fast forward, I notice that I'm not always present. I'm not always present with my family or present with my work in the way that I would like. Amanda, I don't know if any of these resonate for you or for our audience.
Well, like I previously mentioned, sleep is a big one for me.
Mm-hmm.
I usually can tell when I'm really restless, and I have, a Fitbit that tells me how much I've woken up in a night. And so when
Yeah.
I see, oh, you were restless 20 times, I may not have noticed it until I wake up and I feel like I barely slept. So sleep is a big one for me. And kind of like you said, I've noticed that I kind of mentally check out because I'm just
Mm-hmm.
thinking of a bunch of other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I may be speaking with someone and they'll ask me a question and I don't respond right away and they'll ask it again. And I'm like, oh, sorry about that. I wasn't mentally here for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm trying to see if anybody is commenting. We do have some comments
Sure.
that
Sure.
just kind of say, someone said, Facebook is a crazy distraction,
Mhm.
and how important it is to take a break from our busy lives so that you can just kind of get back to reality,
Yeah.
as well as, let's see, yeah, more technology ones. So
Yeah.
just it's technology, you don't really think about it, but it is such a big part of our lives right now.
Technology is a huge one, and it certainly makes my life easier and a lot of people's lives easier, but it's really overwhelming. And one of the things I always suggest, and people sort of give me dirty looks when I say it, which thankfully I can't see anyone say, but I often will ask people, including people I've worked with in the tech industry, ironically, how it feels for them to take a media break, a social media diet, where I have them stay off their pacifiers, which is what I call my cell phone. It's my
Mhm.
pacifier, for like a weekend, right? And see what that feels like. And most people get really anxious when I talk about doing that. And I would say 99% of the time people come back having done it and they feel incredibly relaxed and kind of shocked that social media and consuming all this information has created so much stress to begin with. So I can definitely relate to the audience, in that perspective.
Yes.
So the first step is self-assessment. The second thing is to think about and to do the self-assessment on a regular basis, right? Because sometimes we don't know until our Fitbit tells us or until our partner gives us feedback or things like that. The next thing to do is sort of assess your internal pulls or drives. Um, and what I mean by that is most of us are doing too much or doing a lot or living on fast forward because of our demands. But many of us, not all, but I would say many, many, many of us are also being driven by other things to do too much that we could cut back on. So this is, again, not an exhaustive list, but a list of some of the internal pulls that many people feel that drive them to do more than they need to do. For some people, they tend to be fixers. They they see someone or they see an organization and they just want to fix it. They want to make it better, and they tend to get swallowed up by other people's problems or other organizations' problems. They just dive in to try to fix things. For some people, they're people pleasers. They want to be liked. They want to be viewed positively, and so they set aside their own self to please others to be liked. Some people, and this is one that I see a lot, and I don't know if any of you can relate to it, some people do too much because they're addicted to achievement. They get a high off of it, and they never downshift. And I have an example of that one because it's so prevalent. There was a woman that I worked with who was an executive director, sort of mid to late career, very seasoned executive director, very eager, very bright. And she took on a new job to deal with an organization that was flailing and fractured as a challenge for her. She came in originally for coaching around strategic planning. This executive director, her strengths were people skills, creating key connections among stakeholders. She was actually pretty good at strategic planning already. She came into the organization really wanting to prove herself and make some serious inroads to kind of show people that she could do it, that she could achieve it, even in this really fractured, flailing organization. She was addicted to achievement. As a result of that, she ended up working many more hours than she really needed to. She made herself accessible at all hours, day and evening, by phone or in person or email. She took on some very lofty goals for the organization, considering how badly they were doing and how badly they were struggling. She was connecting with stakeholders all the time, doing tons of speaking engagements and things like that. And she found herself very quickly becoming, excuse me, less focused, burning out, and less able to deal with her employees. She found herself being irritable and short with them, which was a really bad sign, because that was one of her key strengths, was really creating connections with people. And so, yes, did she have some demands? Absolutely. But her addiction to achieve clearly drove her to work in a way that she didn't need to, and did not end up being useful to her long term, until she pulled back. So that's sort of an example of that. The other one is imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is actually pretty prevalent. It's sort of characterized by people who have chronic self-doubt about themselves, who feel inadequate. They, excuse me, can't enjoy their successes despite obvious successes they've had. And these are people who constantly worry that they're going to be found out for not being worthy or good enough. Imposter syndrome can affect anybody. The research finds that it's much more prevalent amongst women and people of color, but certainly it's something that anyone can unfortunately find themselves dealing with. An example of that I have is a man who came in for coaching, who owned his own business. He was actually very successful in his own industry, and had decided to open up his small boutique company of his own. Very bright guy, really great at communicating, very genuine, had a lot of contacts, could have easily built this business quite quickly, but he was filled with doubt and didn't manage it. Things that he would say to himself, as an example, would be things like, I'm not good enough, I'm a fraud, I don't know anything, I'm not an expert, who's going to come to me? And if they do, they're going to find out I don't know what I'm doing. And this was really counter to who he was as a professional. So this man, as a result, ran himself ragged to prove to clients that he was capable, and ended up over preparing for meetings. He constantly provided freebie services to clients to prove his worth. He had difficulty saying no to various businesses and volunteer asks from others. And when he was given praise, and when he was given awards, clearly for his good work, he sort of shrugged them off, chalked it up to chance, and just kept doing more and more. And obviously, as a result, felt really overextended and frazzled at work. I'm curious if the audience can relate to any of these sort of internal pulls, to kind of reflect on what are the things that drive them above and beyond their demands, because for most people, there are internal pulls that drive us above and beyond the demands of our lives to do more. To really think about if any of these internal pulls resonate for you, or perhaps other kinds of drives or pulls, to think about how far back those drives and pulls go, right? So if you're a people pleaser, how far back does that go? And what can you be doing to move forward and not allow these things to dictate so much of how you work or how you are at home, right? The next thing to do is to kind of assess your values. And I'm hoping the audience can start to do this activity that I'm going to outline in a second, and certainly if you can't complete it, to try it on your own. You know, think about the last time you did some really great thinking, or were particularly happy in the past few weeks. Think about a time where you really allowed yourself to linger on something that really mattered to you. The answers that you come up with can really help guide in determining what you really value in your life, and can help you sort of course correct and head in that direction. So I wanted to have everyone take a look at this chart, this values chart, very basic chart. And I want you to look at each of the constructs listed: partner, spiritual, parent, interest, medical health, what have you. And just make sure that the constructs that I listed on this chart are relevant to you. And if they're not relevant, simply don't think about them when we move forward with the activity, or you can feel free to replace them with a construct that really is important to you or relevant to you in your life. So just take a minute to take those constructs in and see if they all make sense to you and are important to you. And then the first thing I'd like for you to do is just rate each construct based on how important it is to you from a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the most important and 0 meaning none at all. And it doesn't matter if you rate multiple constructs the same number, doesn't matter. Just go ahead and rate as many of those constructs that make sense to you. Again, on a scale of 0 to 10. And then what I'd like for you to do is when you've completed that, either right now during the webinar or on your own, go back and rate them again on a scale of 0 to 10, but I want you to rate them based on how much intentional effort and energy you put into each category, right? So for example, excuse me, you may rate your partner as a 8, 9, 10 in terms of importance to you. But when you go back to rate how much intentional effort or energy you put into your partner, you may only rate them a 5 because maybe while you work with them, maybe while you have dinner with them every night, or maybe while you sit side by side in the living room in the evenings, both with your own laptops working, that's not necessarily intentional effort or energy. So you may find that you rate your partner very high, but how much effort you put into that may be relatively low, right? So go ahead and rate each construct based on how much intentional effort and energy you put into each category. And take a look and see what your priorities are, which is based on the first rating. And are you acting on them accordingly, which would be the second rating? Are any of you finding any discrepancies? For me, up until relatively recently, a couple of years ago, I would rate work lower. Yes, I need to work for a living because, I need the income, but it's not as much of a priority to me as, for example, my partner or the rest of my family or things like that. But the time, the intentional effort and energy I was putting into the category was much higher. So that was a big discrepancy for me amongst others, of course. For some, they value their medical health, but don't always put in the intentional time and energy because of being on fast forward. Amanda, I don't know if you're finding any discrepancies or if the audience can relate to any discrepancies either.
I'm finding a lot of discrepancies.
Yeah, most people, yes, you're saying those sheepishly, but most of us find an incredible amount of discrepancies if we're being honest with ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So based on that values, that sort of quick and dirty values assessment, what you can do is start to then develop your blueprint. And again, this is another way of being, meaning this is another way of being intentional in our lives. And really fill out the blueprint, right? So what, based on the values blueprint or not, just based on what's a priority for you, what are some of the priorities in your life personally, just in your personal life? Whether it's family or friends, volunteer work, your health, maybe spirituality, hobbies, interests, passions. And when you have a chance, fill out that blueprint. What are your priorities in life professionally? And try to be specific. So instead of career, be more specific. Um, what are your hopes and fears professionally? Are you, in general, acting in line with your priorities that you listed above? Some people, absolutely, they are, and some people, many people, are absolutely not. In looking at this, where do you feel like you need to put more energy based on the discrepancies you're finding? And to start, prioritize, and I have down here the top 3 areas that you'd like to put more energy into. But to start, just to make it more bite-sized, more manageable, it may be even useful to just list one area that you'd like to put more energy into, whether that is work, a specific issue at work, or a specific issue at home, right? More communication with your partner, or switching jobs, or exploring other careers, or more time with your family. So prioritize 1 or up to 3 areas that you'd like to put more energy into. And then really sit and think about one sort of small, concrete step you can take to make a move in that area, right? So for example, if it's really your medical health, you really, really value your health, but you're really not doing as much about it, list a small concrete step you could take, right? Whether that's saying to yourself, well, I don't work out at all, and I need to be given my family history. So I'm going to start by walking once a week for 15 minutes, and then increase that by a day the following week, and so on and so forth till you build up. The key is to start with really small, bite-sized, very manageable, concrete steps to motivate you. The people who always take on huge, lofty goals find that they tend to become demotivated pretty easily. So again, this blueprint, and hopefully you'll spend some more time on this after the webinar, just kind of helps orient you as to, what you're doing, helps you be aware of places you want to be, more intentional, and reminds you of what's sort of important to you, and can help orient you towards those things slowly, slowly. And the key is slow. We don't have to sort of make our lives upside down. We can just slowly sort of orient ourselves towards things that are important to us. And one of the last things I'm going to talk about is engaging in check-ins in order to be. We naturally have check-ins built into a lot of places in our lives. We, at work, we check in with colleagues. Managers check in with us. At home, we check in with our children or other family or friends. How are you doing, right? It brings us back to the first few minutes of the seminar. But how often do you really check in with yourself? It's really important to do weekly check-ins, or even every other week check-ins. And everyone's sort of check-in will be a little bit different. But what this does is it forces you to be. Again, it forces you to pause, to reflect, and to analyze and refine before you do. And so just check in with yourself. How are you doing emotionally this past week? Cognitively, physically, spiritually? And if you're doing well, what did you do to contribute to that? Because you want to capitalize on that going forward. And if you weren't doing as well, why do you think that was? And how can you sort of shore up for the next week? Think about, were you engaged with what you value in the past week professionally and personally in general? I mean, as much as is realistic. And if so, again, what allowed you to do that? And if not, why not? And how can you sort of course correct, or how can you sort of prepare for the upcoming week, both professionally, excuse me, and personally? these check-ins can be really important because the reality is the demands of our lives kind of push and pull us in all sorts of different directions. And most people don't take time to do these kinds of check-ins. But I would build it into your schedule. Set aside time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes once a week or once every 2 weeks, or build it into something you already do. For example, I had a coaching client that loved to run, which I just think is so unnatural, but good for him. Um, he loved to run. He ran 4 or 5 times a week, and during one of his runs, this was the time that he would do his check-in, for himself. And to sort of finish up, I know it feels very counterintuitive to be telling people to just be for a moment before they do, but it is really in those pauses in life, it is in the quiet that we often find clarity, which can inform us how we want to proceed, both professionally and personally. And again, to not be sort of that leaf in the wind, just getting pushed and pulled by demands. These are all concepts I learned based on science, based on observing people, based on the work that I do. And while we could talk about this topic for several more days, which I'm sure you don't want to be stuck on this webinar with me for several more days, this hopefully will be a useful jumping off point as you start this process of being more intentional and being. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so we have about 15, a little less than 15 minutes left. I'm going to encourage everyone, if you have any questions, we'll devote the rest of the time to that. So feel free to start sending those in. I'm actually going to go back through and see if there was a lot of comments coming in, so I just want to make sure I didn't miss specific questions. Let's see here.
You can feel free to share the comments too if you think that might be useful in the discussion.
Yeah, there were some that were starting to group together with common topics. So let's see. One person was saying that they try to be very aware of communication styles. They recently were under a lot of stress and got some feedback that they were being perceived as abrasive, and that was their kind of a wake-up call that, oh, I had no idea I was being perceived as that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the thing is when we're on fast forward, even though it feels like a good thing to do because it makes us so productive, we eventually do burn out, and we eventually, what I call, leak, which sounds really unattractive, but you don't want to be leaky, and people leak in different ways, and this communication style or coming off as abrasive is just one way of being leaky, right? For other people, it's some of the other things that we mentioned on the second or third slide, I believe, the sleep issue that you've mentioned, the muscle tension and irritability I mentioned. It's really good to kind of catch yourself and do those check-ins with yourself before you get to a point where you're leaking, whether you're leaking at work or at home, or what have you. So that's definitely something that's very common. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then we had several comments again on the technology that, even if you're doing a family activity, a lot of people are on their phones during that, or the fact that we all have access to work email 24/7, and so to step away from work is not as easy as just 5 o'clock, go home, as it used to be.
Sure. Yeah, it really requires that we really set more limits for ourselves. And again, that goes back to that blueprint and formulating what's important to you. How do you want to be in your week? And the reality is many of us work jobs that don't shut off at 5 o'clock. I don't think I know anyone actually who does, which is sort of sad that I'm thinking about it. But that doesn't mean we have to go, right? Indefinitely. I think, the technology issue is a big piece, not in terms of learning to set limits, but also in terms of some of the changes in our brain that technology creates. I mean, it's been linked to a lot of science saying that all this technology that we're bombarding ourselves with can actually and is actually leading to decreased focus and attention. It causes us to be less able to filter out what's important from unimportant. And as we all know, it sort of activates pleasure centers in our brain, so it is literally quite addictive. And so really trying to be present and mindful in those important moments is pivotal. And again, I always recommend to jumpstart the process that those media or media diets. Stay off your phone for unless it's for work, but on the weekends or evenings, stay off of the phone, even if it's for a few hours, just to see how you feel. Initially, you'll feel anxious, but hopefully that will pass. And most people find that they feel less stressed.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see here. Oh, someone asked, what steps would you take to encourage someone else who is in fast forward?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's always hard to kind of put a mirror in front of someone, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the best things to do, and some of this is obviously going to depend on how receptive the person is to any feedback you might be giving them. But one of the first steps to do is to actually let them know what you're seeing that is worrying you instead of focusing on sort of, I notice you're doing too much, or you feel sped up, or you need to relax, or what have you. Really point out some of the specific things that you're noticing um, back to them, because a lot of people don't realize things until they're given that specific feedback. Earlier, you mentioned someone had been given specific feedback about their communication style and being abrasive. Didn't even register until someone said that. That's very common. That's something that happens for all of us. So sometimes a good first step is to just let them know that you're noticing some very specific things and you're wondering if perhaps those specific things might be a telltale sign of them being sped up.
So we have this kind of plays off of that, I guess, in the other role, but we've had a couple people ask, the emotional side is really hard to tell when you're in that. So is it recommended
Mm.
that you upfront ask your family members to help you with that or to pinpoint those things for you?
So some of the emotional quote
Yeah.
unquote symptoms, yeah.
Yes.
So one of the things is two things. One, when you do check-ins on a regular basis, for some people it's going to be really hard because they have to practice being insightful about themselves. And some of us are really good at being insightful about other people, but it's hard to look at yourself, right? And so you find that if you do the check-ins over time, it's almost as if you're building up like that muscle, quote unquote, muscle associated with insight. And you do get better at um, assessing when you're having some emotional issues, whether it's irritability or stress or sadness or anxiety. The other thing you can do that I highly recommend, I'm glad you asked, or whoever asked this question asked, one of the things you can do to kind of keep yourself in check is reach out to only trusted either family members or friends, or maybe even a coworker, but it absolutely has to be someone you trust. Because one of the things you can do is when you gather that group of people together, or even that person or persons, um, you can check in with them as well and have them give you feedback about how you're doing so you can get a sense if what you're observing is similar to what they're observing until you fully develop that strength or that muscle of self-observation. But getting other people involved in that process whom you trust can be really helpful, and perhaps you can do that for them. And that's something, maybe you don't have to do every week, but maybe every month or so. And just say, I'm noticing I'm feeling kind of stressed out or overwhelmed. Are you noticing that as well in me? Why or why not? So those are two things you can kind of do.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Trying to just make sure I touch on most of these. Um, I will say we did get a lot of comments of people saying their different polls. So people pleasing
Oh,
was a big one. Um,
yes.
imposter syndrome. I would say they're actually
Yeah.
all fairly even. A lot of insecure with downtime and a lot of fixers
Mm-hmm.
came in during that time.
Yeah. Insecurities with downtime is really, it's sort of interesting because some people just don't, um, they don't like downtime for a couple of reasons. Either downtime then allows their brain to spend time on things that they're trying to avoid, right? So some people, I know some people who keep really, really busy so they have to, so they can avoid certain things, whether it's difficulties at home with a partner or a mother that's ailing or, what have you. And some people really have difficulty with downtime, not because they're necessarily avoiding something tragic or difficult, but because they feel like downtime is associated with being lazy.
Mm,
And certainly we live in a culture where, you know, it's really reinforced to be busy all the time and go, go, go. It's funny because when I get together with parents at my daughter's school, people will be like, "Oh, I was so busy this weekend. It was horrible. I ran this errand. I had to go to this soccer game with it, and blah, blah." And when the people who say, "Oh, I had a pretty relaxing weekend," people kind of look at them suspiciously, like, what's wrong with them?" So yeah, absolutely.
that's funny. So after the fixers came in, we did have a few people say that they have started just looking at it differently. They are a fixer, but they've realized that there's just things that they can't fix or shouldn't fix, and that's kind of how they break it down in their mind and
Hmm.
move forward, which I
Yeah, I
think is
think,
great. But
yeah, no, I
yeah,
think the fixing thing is huge. I think,
yeah,
especially amongst females, although nowadays I'm beginning to think it's pretty much equal.
hmm
Um, but, yeah, it's always useful to look at, like, if you're jumping in to fix something, why and what might you be getting out of it? And is it something that's doable? Is it something that you have the bandwidth for? And is it a priority, right? So obviously, if it's something wrong with your child, it's kind of a priority.
right.
But is it going to be a priority with everybody that you meet? Likely not. So I think that's great. That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
This comment just came in. It just says, it is hard. If it's hard for us to be comfortable, just imagine for our children growing up in this busy lifestyle where they feel they can't just be either and need to be on a soccer team or piano or on their iPad or any other activities.
Yeah.
That's a good
I mean,
point.
I think that's a great point. I think the idea of play time for children has really changed from even when I was growing up to now. Um, and I think you see less unstructured playtime for children now, which in some ways it's great that they're getting exposed to all this new stuff and different activities and things like that. But, science shows that unstructured downtime is really valuable for children for lots of different developmental reasons. And unstructured downtime for adults is also actually quite necessary. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. It allows for replenishment and clarity, and it allows for sort of original ideas to blossom.
Mhm.
And so unstructured playtime for adults is great too. I think that's a great point. It's
Yeah,
so
that is a
true,
great point.
unfortunately. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's everything. Thank you everyone who participated. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Somjee, for your presentation.
you're welcome.
Um, Once again, just to reiterate what I had said at the beginning of the presentation, in case some of you popped in and out, I will be sending an email early next week that will have this recording as well as the slides that Dr. Somjee went through in her presentation. And I believe her contact information will be in that email as well. Um, oh, one more thing. In that email, there will be a brief, very brief survey that we send out after each webinar. It just kind of gives me an idea of what you felt for the webinar, as well as asks kind of feedback so that we can just keep making this webinar program as what you guys want to hear and helps us move in the correct direction. So that's the end of our presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you can join us for future presentations. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.